A British entrepreneur announces he's bringing American-style fast food to Britain for the first time. The concept is revolutionary. Hamburgers, milkshakes, and something called French fries, served in bright modern restaurants that feel like stepping into a Hollywood movie. Within 2 decades, Wimpy had become a £300 million empire with over 1,500 restaurants across the globe. But this remarkable British success story ends in spectacular failure. The company that once rivaled McDonald's for fast food dominance was reduced to a handful of motorway service stations. The brand that introduced an entire generation to burgers and chips simply vanished from Britain's high streets. Now, the really interesting part isn't just about how much money was lost, but how a company with a 20-year head start in the British market was completely destroyed by competitors who understood something Wimpy never did. This is how Britain's Burger King became fast food's biggest failure. The golden beginning. In 1954, when rationing had only just ended and most Britons had never seen a hamburger, J. Lyons and Company made a decision that would change British dining forever. They acquired the UK rights to an American restaurant concept called Wimpy, named after the burger-loving character from the Popeye cartoons. The first Wimpy opened in Coventry Street, London, and it was unlike anything British diners had ever experienced. Here was a restaurant serving American-style hamburgers, thick milkshakes, and something called French fries in a bright, modern setting that felt like stepping into a Hollywood movie. The timing couldn't have been better. Post-war Britain was hungry for American culture, and Wimpy delivered it on a plate. The restaurants were clean, efficient, and served food that felt exotic and exciting. For many Britons, eating at Wimpy was their first taste of the American dream. The concept was revolutionary for 1950s Britain. Traditional British restaurants were formal affairs with table service and set menus. Wimpy offered something completely different: casual dining where you could order what you wanted, when you wanted it, and eat it quickly without ceremony. But what really set Wimpy apart was the experience. The restaurants had a distinctly American feel with bright lighting, formica tables, and staff who called you Sir or Madam, while serving food that arrived in minutes rather than the half-hour waits common in British restaurants. By 1960, there were 50 Wimpy restaurants across Britain, and the brand had become synonymous with modern, American-style dining. For teenagers and young adults, Wimpy represented freedom, modernity, and a break from the stuffy traditions of British dining. The expansion explosion. The 1960s marked Wimpy's transformation from successful restaurant chain to global phenomenon. Under the aggressive expansion strategy of J. Lyons and Company, Wimpy restaurants began appearing not just across Britain but around the world. The franchise model was revolutionary for its time. Instead of opening company-owned restaurants, Wimpy sold franchise rights to local entrepreneurs who would operate restaurants under the Wimpy brand. This allowed rapid expansion with minimal capital investment from the parent company. By 1970, there were over 1,000 Wimpy restaurants worldwide. The brand had spread across Europe, into Africa, the Middle East, and even Australia. In Britain alone, there were over 500 locations, making Wimpy the dominant force in what was becoming known as the fast food market. The restaurants became cultural landmarks. Every British high street had a Wimpy, and for many families, eating there was a weekly treat. The distinctive red and white branding was as recognisable as any major retailer, and the Wimpy jingle, "I'm a Wimpy kid," was known by every child in Britain. But here's what made Wimpy's success so remarkable. They weren't just selling food, they were selling an experience that British families had never had before. The casual atmosphere, the quick service, the American-style menu, it all felt incredibly modern and sophisticated. By 1975, the Wimpy brand was valued at over £300 million, making it one of Britain's most valuable restaurant companies. The franchise fees and royalties were generating enormous profits for J. Lyons and Company, while the individual restaurant owners were building successful local businesses. The American invasion. Then came October 1974, and the moment that would destroy everything Wimpy had built. McDonald's opened their first British restaurant in Woolwich, southeast London. Most Wimpy executives barely noticed. After all, Wimpy was the established market leader with over 500 restaurants and 20 years of experience in British fast food. What could one American restaurant possibly do to threaten their dominance? But McDonald's had something Wimpy didn't: a revolutionary approach to restaurant operations that would change everything. While Wimpy restaurants were essentially traditional restaurants serving burgers, McDonald's had created something entirely new: a food production system that prioritized speed, consistency, and efficiency above all else. The contrast was immediately apparent to anyone who visited both restaurants. At Wimpy, you'd sit down, order from a waitress, and wait for your food to be prepared fresh. The experience was pleasant but slow, and the quality varied significantly between different restaurants. At McDonald's, you'd queue at a counter, order from a limited menu, and receive your food within minutes. Every burger was made exactly the same way, every time, in every restaurant. The result was faster service, lower costs, and a product that customers could rely on regardless of which location they visited. But here's what Wimpy's management completely failed to understand. McDonald's wasn't just another burger chain. They had created an entirely new business model that made traditional fast food concepts obsolete. The McDonald's system was based on what they called speedy service: precise timing, standardized procedures, and equipment designed specifically for high-volume burger production. Every aspect of the operation was designed for efficiency, from the limited menu that reduced preparation time to the disposable packaging that eliminated washing up. The warning signs. By 1978, just 4 years after McDonald's arrival, the warning signs were everywhere. McDonald's had opened 50 restaurants across Britain and was expanding at a rate of 1 new restaurant every month. Meanwhile, Wimpy's growth had not just stalled, it was actually declining as struggling franchisees began closing their doors. The financial impact was becoming clear in J. Lyons and Company's annual reports. Wimpy's contribution to group profits, which had grown steadily throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, began to flatten and then decline. Franchise fees were harder to collect as existing operators struggled with falling sales. But the real problem was becoming apparent to anyone who visited both chains. McDonald's restaurants were consistently busy, with queues of customers attracted by the fast service and competitive prices. Wimpy restaurants, by contrast, often sat half-empty, their table service model looking increasingly outdated. A former Wimpy franchisee from Birmingham later recalled, "We could see what was happening, but nobody at head office seemed to understand. McDonald's was serving 3 customers in the time it took us to serve one, and their food was cheaper. We kept asking for help, for new systems, for anything that would let us compete, but nothing came." The franchise model that had enabled Wimpy's rapid expansion in the 1960s was now working against the brand. Because franchisees operated largely independently, there was enormous variation in food quality, service standards, and restaurant appearance between different Wimpy locations. Some maintained high standards, others cut costs and let standards slip. The corporate response. In 1979, facing mounting pressure from franchisees and declining profits, J. Lyons and Company finally acknowledged that Wimpy needed to change. They announced a £10 million modernisation programme that would transform Wimpy restaurants to compete with McDonald's. The plan sounded impressive on paper. New restaurant designs, updated equipment, streamlined menus, and faster service systems. Wimpy would retain its British character while adopting the efficiency that made McDonald's so successful. But the execution was a disaster. The £10 million was spread across hundreds of restaurants, meaning each location received only modest improvements. More critically, the changes were implemented inconsistently, with some franchisees embracing the new systems, while others resisted or couldn't afford the required investments. Meanwhile, McDonald's continued their relentless expansion. By 1980, they had over 100 restaurants in Britain and were opening new locations faster than Wimpy could modernise existing ones. Worse, McDonald's was targeting prime high street locations, often opening directly opposite established Wimpy restaurants. The impact was immediate and devastating. A Wimpy restaurant in Manchester that had operated profitably for 15 years saw its sales drop by 40% within 6 months of McDonald's opening across the street. Similar stories were repeated across the country as customers switched to the faster, cheaper alternative. The beginning of the end. By 1982, the situation had become critical. Wimpy's restaurant count had fallen to fewer than 400 in Britain, down from over 500 at its peak. Many of the closures were in prime high street locations where rents were high and competition from McDonald's was fiercest. J. Lyons and Company's annual report for 1982 made grim reading. The company's restaurant division, which had been dominated by Wimpy's profits for 2 decades, reported its first loss in the brand's history. The report blamed increased competition and changing consumer preferences, but offered no clear strategy for recovery. But here's what made the situation even worse. It wasn't just McDonald's that was destroying Wimpy. Burger King had arrived in Britain in 1977, bringing another American fast food concept with operational standards similar to McDonald's. KFC was expanding rapidly in the chicken market. Even British companies were modernising their operations to compete more effectively. The fast food market that Wimpy had created and dominated for 20 years was being taken over by competitors who understood something fundamental that Wimpy never grasped. Success in fast food wasn't about serving good food in pleasant restaurants. It was about serving acceptable food very quickly and very cheaply. A former J. Lyons and Company executive later admitted, "We kept thinking that British customers would prefer our approach, proper service, freshly made food, a more civilized dining experience. We couldn't accept that people just wanted their food fast and cheap. By the time we understood what was happening, it was too late." The corporate betrayal. In 1989, facing mounting losses and declining market share, J. Lyons and Company made the decision that would seal Wimpy's fate forever. They sold the Wimpy brand to United Biscuits for an undisclosed sum, ending 35 years of ownership and investment in the brand. United Biscuits, better known for making McVitie's biscuits and Penguin bars, promised to revitalise Wimpy with fresh investment and modern management. The company's chairman declared that Wimpy would reclaim its rightful place as Britain's favourite burger restaurant. But United Biscuits fundamentally misunderstood what had made Wimpy successful and what was needed to compete in the modern fast food market. They treated Wimpy like a traditional food brand that could be managed through marketing and product development, rather than understanding that success in fast food required operational excellence and systematic expansion. The promised investment never materialized at the scale needed. While McDonald's was spending millions on new restaurant openings, staff training, and operational improvements, United Biscuits allocated relatively modest budgets to Wimpy's revival efforts. Worse, the company seemed unable to decide what Wimpy should be. They experimented with different restaurant formats, menu changes, and marketing approaches, but never committed fully to any single strategy. The result was confusion among franchisees and customers alike. By 1995, just 6 years after the acquisition, Wimpy had fewer than 300 restaurants in Britain. Many of the remaining locations were struggling financially, operating in outdated premises with equipment that hadn't been updated in years. The final collapse. The end came not with a dramatic announcement, but with a slow, painful decline that stretched over more than a decade. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Wimpy restaurants continued closing at a steady rate as franchisees gave up trying to compete with better-funded, more efficient competitors. United Biscuits, realizing that Wimpy was a drain on their resources rather than a profitable investment, began looking for ways to exit the restaurant business entirely. In 1999, they sold Wimpy to a management buyout team led by former Wimpy executives, but the new owners lacked the capital needed to revive the struggling brand. The fundamental problems that had plagued Wimpy for decades remained unsolved. The restaurants were still inconsistent in quality and service. The brand had no clear identity or positioning in an increasingly crowded market. Most critically, there was no systematic approach to operations that could compete with the efficiency of McDonald's or other major chains. By 2000, there were fewer than 100 Wimpy restaurants left in Britain. The brand changed hands several more times as various investors attempted to revive it, but none had the resources or expertise needed to rebuild what had been lost. Each new owner promised a revival that never materialized. Plans for modernization, expansion, and rebranding were announced with great fanfare, only to be quietly abandoned when the scale of the challenge became apparent. Today, fewer than 70 Wimpy restaurants remain in Britain, mostly in motorway service stations and small towns where they face limited competition. The brand that once rivaled McDonald's for dominance of the British fast food market has become a nostalgic curiosity, remembered fondly by older customers but largely irrelevant to modern diners. What we lost forever. The collapse of Wimpy represents one of the most spectacular failures in British retail history, but it wasn't the result of a single catastrophic decision. Instead, it was the cumulative effect of multiple strategic mistakes that compounded over decades. The first and most critical error was failing to understand what McDonald's represented. Wimpy's management saw McDonald's as just another competitor offering similar products at similar prices. They failed to recognize that McDonald's had created an entirely new approach to restaurant operations that made traditional fast food concepts obsolete. The franchise structure that had enabled Wimpy's rapid expansion in the 1960s became a liability in the 1980s. Because franchisees operated largely independently, it was impossible to implement the kind of systematic changes needed to compete with McDonald's. Even when the parent company recognized what needed to be done, they lacked the control necessary to ensure consistent implementation across all restaurants. The multiple changes in ownership also proved devastating. Each new owner brought different priorities and strategies, preventing the consistent, long-term investment that would have been needed to rebuild the brand. Instead of the sustained effort required to modernize operations and rebuild market position, Wimpy experienced a series of short-term initiatives that never had time to succeed. Perhaps most fundamentally, Wimpy's management never fully accepted that the market had changed permanently. They continued to believe that their early success in bringing American-style fast food to Britain gave them some inherent advantage, even as newer competitors demonstrated superior operational capabilities. For the millions of Britons who grew up eating at Wimpy, the brand's decline represents the loss of something uniquely British. While McDonald's and other American chains offered efficiency and consistency, Wimpy had provided a more relaxed, distinctly British take on fast food that many customers preferred. Conclusion. So there you have it. From the first Wimpy restaurant in Coventry Street in 1954 to the corporate failures that destroyed a £300 million empire. A story that captures everything about British business success and failure. Because Wimpy wasn't just a restaurant chain. It was Britain's introduction to American culture, the place where families discovered burgers and milkshakes, and a symbol of the country's embrace of modern, casual dining. For 2 decades, Wimpy represented the future of British food. Next time you pass one of the few remaining Wimpy restaurants, remember what it once represented. Remember when British fast food meant something different from the global chains that dominate today. Remember when eating a burger felt like participating in the American dream, served with a distinctly British twist. And if this journey through British business failure has fascinated you, subscribe for more stories from the companies that shaped our nation. And watch the video on screen about how other British retail giants met similar fates, because sadly, Wimpy's story has become all too familiar in modern Britain.